It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about boxing numbers, and we are going to talk about boxing pay and UFC pay. And once again, John doing his homework. We're going to look at Matt Brown and some things that he had to say on Damon Martin's show. We're going to look at a TKO press release about buybacks of shares. We're going to take a look at Gervonta Davis and Jake Paul getting moved. We're going to look at Alex Hernandez's interview that he gave to Ariel Helwani. There is so much that we have packed into this episode, but if you want access to all of it, you're going to need to subscribe with your money because some of it will be behind a paywall. I do want to pay homage to someone real quick. Thomas Gerbasi, excellent writer, author, used to work for Sherdog. At the time of his unfortunate passing, he worked for UFC, but he passed away this week, and he's someone that I have known personally for about 20 years, back when he was working with Sherdog, and I first jumped on the scene. He was one of the very nicest people I knew. And last week, I was given a copy of his new book by his publicist at his direction. You know, just a few days later, we get the news that he has passed away, and I know John knew him too, so I just wanted to tip my hat and say rest in peace because he was a gentleman and a great writer. John, do you want to say anything?
Well, I will say I didn't know him that well, nearly as well as you, but I've interacted with him, let's say, on mostly through emails and stuff. I don't think I never met him personally, but he is when you talk about the nice guy in the industry, he's one of those people that everybody just had nice things to say about. If you talk to other writers, other people working in the media, if you need something, he's a name that would be thrown about a lot as a really nice guy, helpful guy for everybody. I don't think I remember one person saying a bad word about him. And remember, I was on the MMA JA when they had a meltdown and everybody yelled at everybody. No one said anything bad about him. So that he is, very well liked, I would say, amongst the media. And he was also a very talented guy and a great boxing writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I noticed that everyone from promoters to fans to other writers to legacy media, I mean, just everyone had the nicest things to say because he was so very well respected too. So in any event, I just wanted to give a small token of our gratitude to his life on this earth. So, all right, we're going to jump into a really good piece of writing by my counterpart here, Mr. John Nash. This piece can be found on Uncrowned right now. Uncrowned is over on Yahoo. So make sure that you check it out and give our boy some clicks because he put in his homework. Dana White says that nobody's really doing their homework, but John actually has done his homework and then some. So there were some talking points that Dana White had regarding boxing and MMA pay. What did he say, and what did you find when you went digging and doing your homework, John Nash?
Well, first I want to say this is probably a tip to there's a lot of people who want to get into MMA media, and I always say don't, because I'm not really, I'm casually in MMA media. I have a day job and I do this on the side. And Uncrowned, Sean Elshanti was nice enough. He called me and said, hey, you want to post some articles on Uncrowned? We'll pay you a decent going rate for MMA writers. And I agreed, and I said, I have this idea for this time, to, just about the comments Dana White said last week. Now, here's the mistake I make that all young writers should realize. realize how long your article is going to be ahead of time. Because if this was 1,000 words, it made sense going to Uncrown because they have a set fee. But it ended up being a freaking monstrosity. It was like 3,000 words. And I should have taken that to Front Office Sports, who pays by the word, and I would have made a lot more. So that's my bad. That's some advice to everybody. Go where you're going to get paid the most. That's what, as a fighter, you should do. And as a writer, I really, really badly failed that. But I'm still happy that Sean went through, made a title, did the edits and everything for me. So I'm not that mad, but I probably should have gone somewhere. I would have made more money for the amount of what it ended up being. That said, if people remember last week, Dana White did the rounds for Canelo versus Crawford, and he had some pushback against people saying that boxers make more than MMA fighters, which was interesting because I went through all those interviews. They were talking about MMA fighters, not really the UFC fighters. Usually Dana White stresses UFC fighters make more than boxing. He was saying MMA fighters, and he had some talking points such as, and let's go through each of them. We'll go through and I rebut these in the article. So I recommend you read the article. We have a lot of details on certain fighters' pay and and stats that we got out of the lawsuit and reported payouts. But one thing Dana White brought up, he said, most guys in boxing make only $100 a round. Now, that means the guys getting that are probably fighting at the lowest level. That's 4 rounders. That's $400 a fight. Well, we have as many athletic commissions reports as we can get, and it looks like less than 10% of all boxers, less than 10% get that amount. So when he says most, that's a gross exaggeration. Also, MMA fighters are basically the same, less than 10%. And it should be noted too, for a lot of those people getting the lowest purses, I don't know what the percentage is, but I've talked to people about it. You will see a lot of boxers or MMA fighters in certain states getting like $1 or $0 as a professional. And these guys' record is way too good to get that amount. And you talk to people and, people like Kurt Emhoff and others, and they will suggest those fighters might be either working on some sort of commission system where they're, bringing a bunch of ticket sellers in, they get a big percentage of that, or they're foreign fighters and the money is not being paid in the state because they want it being paid overseas so they can pay less taxes. So they're like maybe keeping the international broadcast rights or some other method. So that would lower their purse. So that's a little, that it's kind of like the locker room bonuses distort the payouts that people say, oh, we don't know what fighters are making. In this case, there's a system in place that some of these guys that are making less than the $100 minimum are actually really making more. But even then, a very small percentage of boxers, not most, are making $100 a round. And then Dana White talked about that the guys that matter, they can make a lot, that what you eat, what you kill. And so in the article, I tried to compare guys that matter. And one of them I brought up is Canelo Alvarez and Conor McGregor. And we can do a direct comparison of them. And we talked about this before this comparison, but looking at it, we see that Canelo Alvarez for 3 matches in 2015 and 16, he generated about $75 million in revenue for Golden Boy, in which he got paid almost $50 million. So almost 2/3 of that went to Canelo. Why, as you look at Conor McGregor, he generated his matches, his 5 big matches, I should say, for Canelo, I used 5 matches from 2014 through 2016. For Conor McGregor, his 5 pay-per-views in 2015 and 16 generated like $240 million total. So Conor McGregor, based on the Dietz method, the method that this accountant used to determine the value generated by a boxer, Conor McGregor was responsible for a little over $100 million of that revenue, of which he got paid, I believe it was $25 million. I could be 25 or 20, no, a little less, 23 million, I believe it was. Or 25, God, I can't remember now. I should have it in front of me, but it's around 25 million, meaning his wage share was about 25% for the event. So in other words, he generated almost 50% more revenue, but he got 1/3 less, or almost half of the pay that Canelo had, which is a huge difference. And I should note too that one of the reasons the wage share for McGregor was so high, 25% compared to most fighters, is at that time, the UFC was putting on a second pay-per-view bonus event. Not only did the opponent against McGregor often get pay-per-view points, I believe for almost all the fights they did, but there was a pay-per-view, a fighter making a pay-per-view on the co-main. And so there were more pay-per-view bonuses being issued out on Conor McGregor events than a typical UFC event. And that would lead it to having a higher wage share for the fighters. So that was, I thought, somewhat interesting. And then the big point Dana White also makes, this is the part where I can't knock him. He's actually right. They spread it around more. There's a premium being in the UFC. There's a concept of a journeyman because of their method of payment. It's this tiered contractual system. If you just survive in the UFC long enough, if you just get enough fights, you end up making what is pretty good money for a fighter in your position. So if you end up fighting 15, 20 times the UFC, but you're going, one win, one loss every time, just because the way the system works, that as you move up, you get new contracts that are higher and higher. By the last several fights, you are making six figures just guaranteed to show up. And if you win, you double that, plus potential fight of the night bonuses. So for fighters like that actually it's a position you would never have in boxing. There's no one in boxing that just is a 500 fighter that's been around forever that's making $300,000 a fight. And that's not uncommon, really. I mean, it's not common either. It's only a handful of fighters, but it happens in MMA and the UFC, which you don't see that in boxing. And so that, we brought that up as well. But I think the key thing is, as much as MMA spreads the wealth, let's say that there's more of a middle class in the MMA. It's obvious from, I think, the data, at least the current data, we don't have updated data because they're hiding the information from us now, is that MMA fighters do not, at the top especially, do not make as much. That boxers as an entity, as a career, as an industry, the fighters themselves in boxing get paid much more than MMA fighters do because they get a higher percentage of the revenue. So I think that's the big takeaway.
I need you to break down a graphic that you posted up that compared an event. You compared a specific Canelo event with a specific UFC event, and the numbers were staggering. Would you mind going through that graphic, please?
Yeah, I shared that one specifically because it was so close to each other and because I had the numbers. The numbers were shared in the UFC antitrust case. They had UFC 111, which was George St. Pierre versus Dan Hardy in the main event. Co-main for the interim heavyweight championship was Frank Mir versus Shane Carwin. That was UFC 111. And then I compared it to Canelo versus Khan. Canelo versus Khan, because we have the Dietz report for the Golden Boy versus Al Heyman lawsuit. They wrote up a whole analysis of Golden Boy's finances at the time. It showed that event made $27.7 million revenue. The event cost, this excludes the compensation for the fighters. This is the cost for marketing, for putting on the event, all that stuff, was $8.9 million. Fighter compensation, the cost to the fighters, and this includes too, I think, per diems and hotel rooms and expenses that go to the fighters themselves, was $15.3 million. So over 50%. And this was for the big pay-per-view events, this was actually one of the smaller percentages that Golden Boy paid. Usually they're up in the over 60, 70%. So then the amount of money left over after the expenses was $3.3 million for Golden Boy. Compare that to UFC 111. It did $28 million in revenue, so just a few million more than the Canelo versus Khan. Event costs were $6 million, for a few million less than Canelo Khan. But this is the big one, I'm sure that caught your eye. Fighter compensation. And remember, George St. Pierre's on this event. $3.8 million total.
And so remind me what the Canelo Khan fighter compensation was again?
That was $15.3 million.
Oh, my goodness.
So we're talking, almost 5 times as much. About 4 times as much, excuse me. And so, and the net then for the UFC, because they have similar revenue, because they have similar costs, but because they have less, they're paying much less they're paying the fighters. Instead of a $3.3 million net money left over at the end, they have $18.3 million left over. And this is not uncommon because if you look at the antitrust lawsuit, they have a document showing the earnings, the EBITDA per event, in other words, the amount of money left over after the event expenses. And they do put the EBITDA, I think it was like 60% was what they're shooting for these events at the time. And so because this one was more successful, they had a lot more money left over. And I should note too, the Canelo Khan, there is some discussion too, is this all the revenue and all the payouts? Because Khan said himself that I believe he said he got $11 million for this fight, and that shows from Golden Boy only $2 million. And it is possible, because this is the way boxing works, is that a portion either of the I think it was on HBO at the time, this event. The HBO pay-per-view revenue was paid directly to Khan in the UK, so it didn't even go through Golden Boy, although that's not really how they usually do it. Or the pay-per-view event that I think Frank Warren won the rights to, that money went to Khan. And so that was kept separate because it's in the UK, and that way they can pay less taxes on it. So there's also the possibility that the amount of revenue the event did higher, and the wage share for the fighters then would go up a lot because Khan would be getting all this extra money. So there's that possibility. But just at these numbers, it just shows you that this is why the UFC is so valuable, is because they can generate numbers that you see in boxing. But they don't have to pay the fighters as much, and so they make insane sums of money. As Mark Shapiro said, we are awash in money.
Yeah, I saw that graphic and I was just blown away by it. That is insane. And one last question: would it be out of character to assume that those kind of margins are still happening right now?
I believe they are. I mean, it's you have to assume, because you look at the UFC's revenue, what they're making. Their EBITDA, remember, for the UFC is like 60%. And that includes would tend to be the more expensive fight nights that are less profitable than pay-per-views. So I assume that they have those type of margins. Still, there's no evidence that they don't. Let's put it that way. The one events that they probably don't have as good of margins on were the Conor McGregor events, the last couple ever since they went to ESPN, because they're not variable based on the number of pay-per-views. It's a flat sum, and so you put this big price tag of Conor McGregor on it on events that sell tons of pay-per-views and should really generate, in a boxing model, would generate huge amounts of revenue, do not generate nearly as much revenue. So Conor McGregor events are probably paying much lower or much higher wage share to the fighters than historically the UFC ever does.
Okay. All right. Matt Brown, let's talk about him, because he had some interesting comments about the MMA business model himself on Damon Martin's show, The Fighter versus the Writer. What did he have to say, and what did you think of what he said? Because I saw a lot of former fighters agreeing with him, and just a single current fighter, and that would be Aljamain Sterling. All the rest of the fighters that were agreeing with him and giving him pats on the back for it were all former fighters, and that seems to be a trend. So tell us about this whole thing.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised it's Sterling. One, he's been on the outs of the UFC. He's a guy that we've seen him time and time again kind of say what's on his mind. He's not Tito Ortiz feuding with the UFC, but he's also not a full-on company man. And he also fits the mold of a fighter. He's talked about too. I think he said he doesn't view himself going to be doing this much longer, right? I think he said that in some recent interviews, yes. A couple more years. And so here's a guy, I think, that sees the end game, what's coming up. And so he's much more willing to say what's on his mind, because he knows that the UFC, what are they going to do to him? This is the end of my career right now. Hold on. I'm getting some text messages, updates that there's something been filed in the UFC antitrust case. I'll have to check later. So that's for next show, people. And so I'm not surprised, man, but it's interesting too, because he had a point in the show where, and I thought this was, great by Damon Martin too, that he kind of acknowledged it, where he talked about how you can't get the pushback Dana White got during this week in boxing, what he got from the media covering the Crawford Canelo fight, because the MMA media is afraid to do it because they know their press pass would be gone and they wouldn't be able to ask Dana White questions in the future. And he even directed that to Damon Martin, who basically agreed. And I've talked to many MMA media guys that kept acknowledge that there are certain things they know they can't ask, which is why when you listen to our show, you'll know I often give a little pushback at people saying, oh, it's all the fighters' fault for not standing up to the UFC. When I've talked to fighters talking about how they're very much afraid of what the UFC will do, but also people that are not fighters demonstrate the same thing, that the UFC has complete control. If you were making this a full-time profession and you had to feed your family based on being a member of the media, unless you're Helwani or Luke Thomas, who built up a big market outside of the UFC ecosystem, you are not going to rock the boat too much, because that they'll pull your credentials. They will do to you what happened to Josh Gross. And where is Josh Gross in MMA media today? What was once the number one reporter in MMA no longer covers the sport. So I think that's a good example there. But Matt Brown, he had a bunch of other interesting points during the show. I think he's a guy that, as he talked about, as a young fighter, he didn't think about this stuff. I'm a fighter. And then, as we've described many times before, the fighter's arc, I think he's a guy that's embraced that, since his journey's over being a fighter, he can look back and analyze what happened. And he does a good job. He's like a lot of fighters that the over with that, and he also points out too about Matt Brown is he doesn't get upset at the UFC. In fact, I think there is still, you can hear him when he talks about it. He might not like the way they function, but there seems to be genuine warmth in the discussion towards the UFC. So I imagine he likes the people there. He likes how he was treated, but he just doesn't like the model. So let's get some of the issues he talks about. One, he says that the UFC has monopolized the sport. He came out and said it. A lot of guys are afraid to say that. He talks about how the UFC monopolized the sport. He talks about something we've talked about in the past. I don't know if he got it from us. Maybe he got it from the antitrust lawsuit, because I believe they bring this up as well. Maybe he's listened to Carlos Newton interviews in the past, but he brings up the fact that fighters are basically in MMA. The system is set up where fighters are competing to get the favors, to beg the UFC for favors, to ask the UFC for the right to do something like fight for the championship or make more money or whatever it is. Whereas in boxing, it's the reverse. The promoters are competing for the boxers because the boxers have independent rank and title. So he brings that up. He talks about also the fact that in the UFC, some fighters are making good money, but it's not good money, as he points out, if you're getting 10 million, but while you're getting 10 million, you're making the promoter 100 million. That might sound, people are like, how can you complain? But it's understandable. If the Rolling Stones are doing a concert and they're only getting 10 million of the 100 million generated, do you think the Rolling Stones are going to be happy with that situation? So he brings that up. And then he brings up a couple things I found kind of interesting. One is he pushes back, or he disagrees with the statement that Dana White says this is not a career. This is an opportunity. And I actually kind of agree with that term Dana White uses, because I think you should be looking at fighting as it's not long-term, like being a bus driver. That's why I view it. But what Matt Brown says, I also think makes a lot of sense. And I think his point is that's wrong for Dana White to say it, because what he's saying is it's an opportunity. Basically, you should just be lucky and try to take advantage of the platform they get you to get money outside the UFC. Where his point of view is, I'm a professional, and this is my career. I've dedicated myself to fighting. This is my career. I should not look at it like you're doing me a favor by putting me on the platform. You should pay me for doing this. And he also points out the whole thing that Dana White, you eat what you kill, is false, because Conor McGregor can go out and sell tons of pay-per-views, but he's only getting a very, very small percentage, as we mentioned earlier. So a lot of good stuff. I really recommend people listen to it. I think it starts, I don't want to say, people probably should listen to the whole show so they can get the listeners, the minutes on it when you listen. But if you just want to listen to these sections, it starts about 27 minutes into the show, the most recent writer versus fighter. Or fighter versus writer, sorry.
TKO had a press release this week that announced $1 billion in share buybacks. For first-time listeners or those that don't follow finance very closely, can you break down what that means? And also, if you think $1 billion is a significant number, a large number.
Well, it's pretty large, considering the revenue that they have coming in. There's buybacks were only made legal in the 1980s and under the Reagan administration. So there's a reason why, in the old days, they didn't want you to. What is a buyback? Well, buyback is when a company takes its income, its profits, and takes that money and goes and buys stock back from shareholders, and then and then just basically merges it back in the company. And so there's less stock available. So the price of the stock that you have, that people that still have shares, increases. The value of the company doesn't change, but the price of a share increases because there's fewer shares outstanding now. And so in this case, they're doing $1 billion, which is about 2.5% of the valuation, the market cap of the company. So if they buy 1 billion shares back. Now, it doesn't always work this way. It's not 1-to-1, but theoretically, the way it should work is that the company's still worth $40 billion, but the valuation of everybody's shares go up 2.5%. And the benefit to this, if you own a large amount of shares, you just gained a lot of money. All right. And it's money that's, that's not really that you don't have to pay tax on your income. You just now have instead of getting a dividend, they have to pay tax as a capital gain. Instead, you have an asset that gains value, which you don't have to pay taxes on yet until you sell them. And the other benefit, too, is if there's future dividends payout, the payments should be larger to those that still own shares.
So what are we to make of that, of all of that?
Well, they have a lot of money. They have a lot of money burning in their pocket because, as Mark Shapiro said, they are just cranking out money. They are a cash machine. And so they have so much money. Not only do they have money to issue a dividend, they have money to buy shares back. And so, and one of the benefits of having shares back, if they retain theirs, they probably have a greater control over the company now. So if you're a rich person and you want your asset to go up in value, that's a good way to do it.
What does that mean for fighters? Do they have any shares in the company?
Well, did they go out and buy any?
Oh, so that's how they get them, right?
Yeah. You don't. I mean, fighters. There's no profit sharing. There's no stock program for the fighters. I mean, some companies I worked at before, I had friends that worked at Disney, and they would get shares every years ago. Then they stopped doing that. But UFC doesn't do that. They wouldn't give equity to Conor McGregor. So that this does nothing for the fighter. I guess the fighter can celebrate, man, look how great we've done on making this company super profitable for other people.
I'm sorry. Sometimes
don't be laughing at the poor fighters.
It's not that. It's, normally you save this dour note for the end. We're getting it all through this podcast. All right. Let's go to an even worse note. Retired boxer Heather Hardy. She was also an MMA fighter in Bellator. Remember, folks? Anyway, she had quite a name in boxing before she even came to Bellator. Like when she came to Bellator, it was kind of a big deal. She is suing her former promoter, the ringside physician, a slew of other people. Looking at the available documentation, what stood out to you the most?
Well, besides the people she's suing, especially Everlast, that stood out the most, that she's suing the producer of the gear she used and had a sponsorship deal with. And she's also suing Lou DiBella and, everybody, the ringside physician, basically everybody involved with their career. The other thing that really stood out to me, I think, are the symptoms she demonstrated, because they're really horrifying. And they are that she lives with CTE, and that she works on a subsistence level from coaching. So she's, barely getting by coaching other boxers. She can only do that a couple hours a day before her brain damage symptoms become incapacitating, which is just horrendous to her. And so she relies on Medicaid for whatever minimal treatment it provides for her issues. So reading that reminds me, remember that when we had all those letters written by the fighters in support of the settlement?
Indeed.
That there's just large numbers of fighters, people that did this sport, that are suffering the consequences from it. And many of them were not rewarded that well for the amount of damage they took. And she's one of them, because her purses were not ridiculously high. We have a list of it, and many of them when she started was $1,000, which is still 2.5 times the minimum that they're pushing for the Ali Act. She had her biggest one. I mean, most of them, very few went above $10,000. I guess she had a bunch on her last string of fights for over $10,000. But her biggest one by far, multiples any other one, was when she fought Serrano, which shouldn't have been a fight that was allowed. But she got $80,000 for that fight. So not, I guess for her position, probably, a great purse considering what she'd been making. But compared to what we've seen in MMA and other female boxers, it's not a tremendous, tremendous purse. And I think this is also an example too, is how in one place that they can kind of boast in UFC and MMA is there is a much bigger fan base or much more interest. Apparently there is, at least generally, just from me looking at it, I haven't looked at data, but it definitely seems like there's more interest in female fighters from MMA fans than we get in boxing. And because of that, they do make MMA fighters overall have been making more than female boxers have, except for now that Serrano and Taylor came around and made millions. That might have changed, but up till then, MMA has definitely been paying female athletes. The men, no, but female athletes a lot more.
Nick Diaz, he was released with very, very little fanfare. It actually seemed like UFC did that on the sly. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I probably didn't want to make a big deal. Maybe he didn't want to make a big deal up. But I think the other issue is, this is one people didn't bring out. He's about a week or so away from the 4th anniversary of when he signed that new contract to come back to fight for the UFC. Remember, he was on a contract that never ended. He was on one of those perpetual old contracts. And so he signed a new contract to come back and fight Robbie Lawler. And that contract, because it's one of the new ones, it has a retirement, a sunset clause, a shitty one, but a sunset clause. But one of them says if you retire or, are inactive for 4 years, it then voids the contract. And so my guess is his contract was coming to an end and they decided to release him because they just couldn't keep him any longer.
He also had some problems. I don't know if they would have booked him for another fight, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, he's been done as a fighter for years, though.
Yeah. But so, beyond him being done as a fighter, because we watched them put Tony Ferguson in fight after fight after fight, Donald Cerrone the same. We've seen them do that. But it seemed like he had obvious mental issues that would have been a real black eye on the UFC, like even more than using up a fighter well past their expiration date. Right?
Oh, yeah. It's also conceivable that whatever issues, because he was retired and was frozen, that they were just basically their decision was if we hang on to his contract, he can't go fight anywhere. I mean, it's possible. I mean, listen, we have a lot of criticisms to the UFC. We have a lot of criticisms of the way they deal with contracts, how they pay fighters, but they're also not the complete monsters, some promoters can be. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be shocked if there's someone over there decided that it would be best to basically hold on to his contract so he could not fight anywhere else.
Yeah.
Considering all the problems he has.
All right. Let's talk about Jake Paul and Gervonta Davis, because they had a pretty major shakeup this week. Their fight was moved from Atlanta, Georgia to Miami, Florida. Why was that? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!